I never imagined that something so simple could completely change the way someone saw me. But it all started with a carelessness, something small, almost insignificant. At least, that's what I thought. That day seemed like any other. The noise of the rain beating the window, the warm smell of the steam coming out of the shower. I relaxed, without haste, taking advantage of the moment. My mind wandered between loose thoughts without any concern. What I didn't realize was that the bathroom door was not completely closed, and that's when it all happened. When I lifted my eyes, I saw a reflection in the mirror. My heart almost stopped. He was there, looking at me, watching me in a way that I had never seen before. For a second, I was frozen. I didn't know if I covered my body, screamed, pretended to be nothing happening. But then something caught my attention, his gaze. It was not just a surprise. There was something more there, something that made my skin shiver, which left me without reaction. It was fast, but it was enough. My chest climbed and descended rapidly. The vapor of the shower looked warmer, suffocating. That moment would never leave my head again. From that moment, nothing more was the same among us. My breathing was stuck in the throat. I felt the blood throb hard, as if my whole body is on alert. My first instinct was to close the door quickly, but I hesitated. He was still there, stopped, without reaction. It was a matter of seconds, but it seemed that time had slowed. His eyes did not flash, fixed on me. I wanted to believe it was just a reflection of surprise, a moment of shock, but something told me there was more. "What are you doing here?" My voice came out firmer than I expected. He swallowed and looked away, but did not respond immediately. The silence that followed was heavy. It looked like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't. Then suddenly turned hurriedly and disappeared down the hall, leaving behind a strange void. I closed the door, now more carefully, and leaned my hands on the sink. My heart beat hard. It was an accident, I tried to convince myself, but when I closed my eyes, his gaze came to my mind. There was something there, something that should not be, and that feeling wasn't leaving. In the following days, something has changed. I could feel. Before, he treated me in a casual way, as it had always been. But now, your eyes always seemed to look for me. It was not obvious. It was subtle. Small moments when I took his gaze stuck in me, and when our eyes were, he diverted fast, pretending distraction. In the beginning, I tried to ignore. Maybe it was my head. Maybe he was just embarrassed by what happened. But then, I started to notice the details. The conversations were different. He looked more interested in what I said, laughed a little more from my jokes, got excuses to be around. Even your posture has changed. If before he was carefree, now he always seemed attentive, as if every word of mine had a greater weight. One night, when I went to get a glass of water, I passed the living room and saw him standing in the hallway. He was looking toward me, but when he saw me, he pretended to be moving on his cell phone. My body shuddered. That was no coincidence. The next day, he appeared in the kitchen early, before everyone. It was closer than usual, and when I went to get the coffee, your fingers brushed my fingers in a way that made me hold my breath. He smiled, almost imperceptible, before leaving. He was watching me, and not in an innocent way. I tried to act as if nothing had changed, but it wasn't just him. I also started to notice things I didn't see before. The way he looked at me when I thought I wasn't seeing. The way I seemed to measure every movement of mine. If before he was distracted, now he always seemed present, always attentive. That morning was a perfect example. We were all sitting at the table, talking about trivial things, but I felt the weight of his gaze on me. It was not uncomfortable, but it made me aware of every gesture of mine. When I finished my coffee, I got up to wash the dishes. In seconds, he was by my side. He said nothing, just stayed there, too close. The silence between us was different. "Want help?" he asked, his voice is hoarse than usual. I shook my head and forced a smile. "It is not necessary." He hesitated before he walked away, but not without looking at me like that again. The warm water was running down my fingers as I pretended to focus on the dishes, but my mind was far away. My whole body was alert. I needed to stop thinking about it. I needed to ignore. But for some reason, my body did not want to cooperate. The little things began to accumulate. If before the eyes were discreet, now they were slower. If before the distance between us was natural, now it always seemed to shorten, even for no apparent reason. I caught myself realizing every detail. The way he greeted me with a different smile, as he arranged excuses to pull conversation, as his presence seemed more constant. But it was the touches that bothered me the most. The first one happened in the kitchen, when he passed behind me and brushed his hand slightly at my waist. Was it too fast to be an accident? I wanted to believe yes. Then came the second. We were on the couch, watching something on TV, when he stretched and his hand landed on my leg for a moment too long. This time, I couldn't ignore it. He looked at me, a smile in the corner of his lips. He said nothing, but his eyes said it all. The next night, something different happened. I passed the hallway and unintentionally bumped into it. I felt your hand hold my waist to firm me, my fingers squeezing lightly before they let go. It was fast, but it made my stomach turn. I should have said something. I should have put a limit, but instead I was there, still, feeling my heart accelerate. The rain fell hard outside, hitting the windows, filling the house with a constant and hypnotic sound. I was in the room, wrapped in a blanket, trying to distract me with a book, but my mind was far away. It was then that I heard steps. I looked at the corridor and saw him there. His eyes found me, and something in his countenance seemed different, more determined. "Can't you sleep?" I asked, trying to keep the tone casual. He hesitated for a moment before approaching and sitting next to me. "Actually, there's something I need to say." My heart leaned, but I kept the neutral expression. What it was? He took a deep breath before speaking, without looking away. "I can't see you just as my aunt anymore." The silence that followed was overwhelming. My mind shouted that it was wrong, that I needed to cut it from the root, but my body did not react. My heart was beating tight, my breath was stuck. He ran a hand through his hair nervously. "I know this may seem wrong, but I can't avoid." The air in the room seemed denser. I needed to say something, but the words simply did not come out, and for a moment everything was suspended in the air. My chest was still climbing and descended, out of way. His words echoed in my mind, and as much as I tried to ignore, I couldn't. I should have closed everything there. It should have cut that conversation and put a clear limit, but instead, I remained silent. I got up from the couch and went to the kitchen, trying to recompose myself. I grabbed a glass of water, but my hand was shaking slightly. I took a deep breath. It was just a moment, a confusion in his head. I needed to treat it the right way. "Heard your steps approaching." He stopped beside me, and even without looking, I felt his presence. His voice sounded hesitant. He said he might not have said anything, that I probably found him an idiot now. My heart accelerated again. I closed my eyes for a moment before answering that he only needed time to better understand what he felt. The silence stopped between us. I felt when he looked away, but his presence was still strong, intense. I wanted to believe this was just a passing impulse, but when he sighed deeply and ran a hand over his hair, I realized it wasn't. And the truth I didn't want to admit was that, as wrong as it was, something inside me was confused. That night, I lay on the bed determined to forget everything. I closed my eyes, trying to ward off what happened, but my mind insisted on reviving every detail. The way he looked at me, the tone of the voice, the hesitation before confessing. I turned in bed, restless. It was wrong. I knew that. But then, why does my body react this way? I wanted to believe it was just a reflection of the situation, a psychological game that my mind was preaching me, something that would soon pass. But as the days went by, I realized that it was not that simple. Each time he entered the same room, I felt something different. It wasn't just discomfort, it was something else, something I didn't want to admit. The worst moment was when, without realizing it, I found myself watching him too. I noticed the way your shoulders had become wider, how different your posture was. It was fast, but real. My stomach turned around. I couldn't think about it. But the truth is that the more I tried to avoid, the more these thoughts came back. And that's when I understood that it wasn't just he was confused. I was too. And this finding made a shiver through my skin. The day seemed to follow normally, but I could no longer act the same way. My mind was constantly divided. On the one hand, I tried to convince myself that none of that was real, that it was just a misunderstanding. On the other, my body reacted so that I could not control. That's when it happened. We were in the kitchen, busy with trivial things. He took a glass from the shelf, and when turning, our bodies met in the tight space. I felt his hands touch my waist to balance, and before I could react, his body was already too close. Time seemed to stop. My heart hammered in my chest. My body was locked. I should have taken a step back, but I couldn't. He also didn't move away immediately. For a moment, our eyes crossed, and I saw the same thing as before. It wasn't just a surprise, it wasn't just a slip. It was desire. He moistened his lips and lowered his head slightly, as if he wanted to say something but hesitated. I should have left, but my legs were caught on the floor. His breathing was close, hot. My chest climbed and descended fast. I realized at that moment that I was fighting something that was already out of my control. And the worst thing was to admit that for a second I didn't want to escape. After that, touch I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening. That night was long. I rolled me on the bed, trying to rationalize everything, seeking any justification that explained what was happening between us. But there was no logic. I needed to talk to him. I needed to end it before it was too late. The next morning, I waited until we were alone in the house. The mood was heavy, loaded with all that was not said. He noticed. He approached slowly and asked if I was okay. I took a deep breath. We need to talk. I saw your expression change. Her shoulders were tense, as if she already knew what I would say. He hesitated, but agreed. We went to the living room, where the silence seemed even more oppressive. My heart beat fast, and as much as I had rehearsed what to say, no word seemed enough. He sat in front of me and waited. I had to end it, put an end point. But when I raised my eyes to face him, I realized that my certainty was no longer that strong. The silence between us was almost unbearable. I knew what I needed to say. I knew what was right. But for some reason, the words did not come out. He waited. His expression was not of guilt or fear. It was something different, as if he was ready to hear anything, even if he didn't want to. My breathing was irregular. My heart beat hard. So finally, I said, I explained that this was a mistake, that none of this should be happening. He said it was confusion of his head. It was better to stop there before it was too late. With each word, I felt my chest squeeze more. He lowered his head for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he raised his eyes again, something in them had changed. And you? His voice came out low, almost a whisper. Do you think it was just confusion? My throat dried up. It doesn't matter. It matters, yes, because if you tell me you felt nothing, I stop. My whole body was tense. The answer was at the tip of my tongue, but something prevented me from saying it. I should feel relief, but for some reason I didn't feel. The air seemed heavier between us. I knew that if I said those words, everything would end there. A no was enough for him to move away for good. But for some reason, my mouth could not form the answer. He waited, the fixed look at mine. My chest climbed and descended quickly. Time seemed to slow down. It was then that something unexpected happened. A noise in the hallway, steps approaching. We turned around at the same time, and my mind has been alert. Someone was coming. Suddenly, everything came back to reality. The weight of the situation, the danger of being discovered, the urgency to act. He looked away, swallowed hard, and stepped back. I retreated too, trying to recover the reason. The door opened. The fright traveled my body. My heart hammered hard. Known voice called my name. He asked what we were doing there alone in the middle of the room with such serious expressions. My body was rigid. My mind was looking for an answer. But before I could say anything, he took the lead and said something that changed everything.